All right, bailiff, if you bring jurors, please. Further questions, Mr. Lively?
Yes, Your Honor. Welcome back, Dr. Nelson. We were about to move to the final penetrating gunshot wound that you have labeled as gunshot wound F. Is that correct?
I labeled the entrance as F, yes.
Yes, sir. And if I may approach, Your Honor, I've got these photographs.
Yes, sir.
These have previously been entered as states 250 through 256, I believe. Or I'm sorry, 257. Would you take a look at those photographs and tell me which one contains entrance wound F? Thank you, sir. Now, Doctor, I believe that you've already testified about the exit wound in this photograph. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. However, within the same photograph, you've also noted the entrance wound F. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And can you give the jury an orientation for where this is on the body?
It might help if we zoomed out a little bit.
Yes, sir.
So this is essentially in the right armpit. We mentioned earlier an exit wound here, and it appears from the location and appearance of this wound, and I'm pointing to something towards the top third of the screen, that the bullet exiting down here where the white label is, then re-entered in the right arm there, and that is the entrance wound that I labeled as F.
I see. So it appears to you that the exit wound from this same picture also then re-entered the body on the other side of the armpit. Is that correct?
The bullet that created that exit wound appears to have then re-entered on the inside of the right upper arm.
And that would be entrance F. Okay. Tell me about where the bullet was found to be lodged within the body.
I found the bullet just underneath the skin on the back outer part of the right shoulder. So I'll point on myself approximately right here, and I'm pointing towards that area on my body.
Okay. And again, The projectile, can you describe the projectile that you removed from the body?
This projectile looked very much the same as the other that I previously described. It had a flat nose, a copper-colored jacket, and a gray metal or lead-colored core.
Yes, sir. And if you can tell us again the direction of this bullet's travel from the penetrating entrance wound F.
The direction through the body was rightward, upward, and backward.
Now, Dr. Nelson, you've sort of talked about directions of travel of several gunshot wounds with regard to this deceased person. Does that mean that the bullet is actually changing directions or moving within the body?
No, the bullet is moving in a straight line through the body. The use of rightward versus leftward tells us which side of the body it tended to go to, upward or downward towards the top or the lower part of the body, and frontward or backward, whether it was traveling from the front to the back or from the back to the front. Putting all those things together gives us an idea in 3D of the direction of that straight line.
And you can tell that from the path from once you've opened the body and are able to observe it through the cavity and through internal organs that may have been struck. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. But again, a bullet when it enters the body follows a straight line based on from where it was fired?
For the most part, yes. They don't bounce around like pinballs. They may have a little bit of deflection from striking hard bone, but for the most part, they travel in a straight line.
Yes, sir. And so if there's a front to back movement or a left to right movement, would that have more to do with the positioning of the decedent's body in relation to the barrel of the gun?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Now, did you observe any other injuries on Mr. Taylor during either your external or internal examination?
In relation to the gunshot wounds on the inside of his left upper arm, just next to the entrance wound that we described as C, if the arm was at the side, there was a small scrape, and that had a little bit of soot deposited on there as well, which suggests that that left arm was at the side at the time that entrance wound C occurred. Other than that injury, he had a few small little scrapes and abrasions on different parts of his body.
But nothing that was particularly noteworthy or cause for concern or part of your opinion about the cause of death?
That's correct.
All right. But you did note perhaps abrasions on the left knee or the right shin. Is that correct?
I'll refer to my report, but yes, that's correct.
And then a irregular pink contusion on the right shin. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. Is there any way to tell the timing or when those injuries were received?
They appear perimortem, occurring around the time of death. They had no findings to suggest that they had occurred days before and were healing, and they did not have findings of being dry and having absence of blood that we might see in injuries that are sustained after death, after the heart has stopped beating.
I see. So these injuries may have occurred around the time of death, and certainly before Mr. Taylor passed.
It appears so, yes.
All right. Well, Doctor, you've described a lot of injuries or from gunshot wounds, but based on your autopsy of Mr. Taylor, were you able to come to an opinion as to the cause of his death?
The cause of his death was multiple gunshot wounds.
And this particular cause of death in the manner you've described it, would this have resulted in an instant death?
Not necessarily. I would expect his death would occur within seconds to minutes based on the injuries, and I really have no way of being more specific than that.
All right. Is the loss of 1,000 milliliters of blood a significant blood loss?
definitely is life-threatening, yes.
All right. How would these gunshot wounds cause the body to shut down and stop responding?
A few mechanisms come into play. The most obvious is blood loss. In addition to the blood that we mentioned pooled in the left side of the chest and the smaller amount in the right side, blood may have leaked out of the body through these wounds. Additionally, there's the trauma of the bullets passing through and inhibiting or decreasing organ function. One of the specific things we can mention is blood accumulating in the left side of the chest prevents the left lung and eventually the right lung from being able to expand and take in air. So there's a number of mechanisms that may be at play here.
And why does the pooling of the blood I guess prevent or inhibit the lungs from functioning properly?
The lung expands and contracts as air is inhaled and exhaled, but if blood is squeezing that left lung down, it has no way to be able to expand and allow the body to take in air.
So in addition to the trauma and the loss of blood over some period of time, also the ability to breathe would be restricted based on these injuries?
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you, sir. Now, shortly after the autopsy of Mr. Taylor, you were asked to perform the autopsy of Anglia Taylor. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And can, let's see, again, it looks like you had a Miss Jones present as well as Detective Bell from the Sheriff's Office. Is that right?
I'll refer to my report, excuse me, while I shuffle this around. Yes, so I had a different assistant for this case.
All right. Well, if you can, just start out by telling the jury what your diagnoses were.
In Ms. Taylor, I found a penetrating gunshot wound of her chest and a perforating gunshot wound of her left wrist.
All right. And in terms of, I guess, normal injuries or illnesses or potential causes of natural disease, you didn't find anything pre-existing in Miss Taylor's body. Is that correct?
That's correct. She appeared otherwise healthy.
Okay. You made note of the clothing that she was wearing. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And did you check for soot on the clothing?
Yes, and the same as with Mr. Taylor, I did not see any soot, but the clothing did have blood on it, which could have obscured the presence of any soot to my eye.
Yes, sir. Now, you also note that there was no evidence of medical therapy. What does that mean?
With any autopsy or anytime someone dies, medics may have been called, or physicians, nurses, others may have tried to render some kind of medical aid. That may be by applying defibrillator pads to shock the heart if needed, putting a breathing tube in, adding intravenous lines to try and give drugs and fluids. At any autopsy, those are left in place prior to autopsy, and we document their presence, or in this case, their absence. So it just indicates to us that there were no application of medical devices to her body.
Correct. And she came to you fully clothed. Is that right? In the same way Mr. Taylor did?
That's correct.
And so that's evidence that there was no attempt or possibility of medical intervention to save these people's lives?
Someone may have tried some chest compressions, but there was no other evidence, or there was no physical evidence that anyone tried anything.
And again, on your external examination of Miss Taylor, do you find anything abnormal?
Other than the gunshot wounds, no.
All right. Well, let's talk about the gunshot wound. Your Honor, may I approach with states 257 through 260?
Yes.
Okay.
Right. Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, Your Honor. This will be 258 through through 261.
Which one did you change?
Just spelled them all back for him. Dr. Nelson, will you take a look at these 4 photographs and tell me if you recognize them?
Yes, these
All right.
are photographs of Ms. Taylor at the time of autopsy.
And are these photographs taken from you or at your direction during the autopsy?
In this case, they were taken by our photographer who was employed at the office at that time.
Okay. But you direct the photographer what photographs to take and are present when they're taken?
That's correct.
And do these fairly and accurately depict the body of Miss Taylor when you were performing the autopsy on her?
Yes, they do.
Okay. And would they help you illustrate your testimony?
Yes.
Your Honor, we'd move states 258 through 261 into evidence at this time.
Any objection?
No, sir.
They're admitted.
Well, sir, let's start with states 258. This is a photograph of Miss Anglia Taylor with identifying information placed there on her chest.
Yes, it is, and the number that you can see there, B14-0948, corresponds to that of her autopsy report.
Yes, sir. All right. Now, you make mention of only 2 injuries in Miss Taylor's case, and the first is a penetrating gunshot wound to the chest. I'm going to show you states 259. Can you describe the entrance wound and its placement to the jury?
This is a photograph of the left side of her chest and the left breast. The white label bears the number B14-948, indicating that this photograph belongs with this autopsy. And just above her nipple, you can see there is an entrance wound. It has the same characteristics that we've previously discussed today of an entrance wound, but it has no soot or stippling around it.
You do mention, however, there are some fragments of, I guess, cloth. Is that correct?
Yes. And I'll refer to my report to see
Yes, sir.
how I described those. Within the wound were a few little pieces of cloth. Black cloth. She was wearing a black bra, and so that would be consistent with the bullet passing through the bra and leaving small pieces of it.
Yes, sir. And she was, I guess, she still had her clothes when she came to you, so you were able to both observe the bra and the black cloth that was embedded in this wound.
That's correct.
Okay. Well, tell me where you found the bullet to be lodged within the body.
The bullet lodged just underneath the skin on the right side of the mid-back, approximately 18 1/2 inches below the top of the head and 3 1/4 inches right of midline.
And can you describe the projectile recovered from her body?
This had a similar appearance to the bullets that I described earlier with Mr. Taylor. It had a flat nose, a copper-colored jacket, and a lead-colored core.
All right. And you took that from her body and, I guess, handed that over in evidence to the sheriff's deputy that was present?
I packaged it in an envelope and then transferred it, yes.
Yes, sir. What can you tell us about the path of the bullet?
This bullet went through the left breast and the left sixth rib. It went through the pericardial sac, which is a tough sac that surrounds the heart. And then it went through, excuse me, the heart itself. It then went through the left side of the liver and went through the right side of the wall of the aorta. The aorta is the largest artery in the body. It is about the diameter of a garden hose, so that can give you an idea of the amount of blood traveling through there. And it then went through the right side of one of the bones of the spinal column, which we refer to as T11, but it did not strike the spinal cord, and then it lodged in the skin, underneath the skin.
All right. And more specifically within the heart, did it perforate any particular wall?
It went through the wall of the right ventricle, which is one of the 4 chambers of the heart.
Yes, sir. And did you make note, you've mentioned, and the jury's already heard some testimony about the pericardial sac. Did you make note of a certain amount of liquid or blood found there?
The pericardial sac, because the bullet had passed through there and through the heart, contained 175 milliliters of blood.
And where else in the body did you find particularly large pools of blood?
Also, in the right side of the chest, or the right pleural cavity, there were over 1,000 milliliters, specifically 1,050 milliliters of blood. And then in the abdominal cavity, there were another 200 milliliters of blood.
Yes, sir. And could you tell us about the direction of the bullets travel through the body?
This bullet traveled through the body backward, downward, and rightward.
Yes, sir. Now, this is the only bullet that you found within this victim's body. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. But there was another gunshot wound of the left wrist that you've noted?
That's correct. She had a perforating gunshot wound of her left wrist.
All right. And I've put up what states exhibit, I believe, 260 at this time. Can you describe to the jury what they're seeing?
This is a photograph of what we'd say is the back of her left wrist. And you can see just above this white label, there is a nearly round defect with the margin of abrasion that we've described as what we see on entrance wounds. This wound had no soot and no stippling.
All right. And I'm going to move to States Exhibit 261. Can you describe what we're looking at in States 261?
So we're looking at her left wrist on the, what we kind of say is the side of the wrist. And this is the exit from that entrance wound that we described. And you can see it's a little bit irregular. It has these almost triangular points of skin that if we manipulate the skin, we would see those go back together and have the features that we see in an exit wound.
Yes, sir. And the direction of this bullet wound, this perforation, can you kind of give us the direction of the bullet's travel?
This is a little bit trickier because we never know what position an arm may be in at the time. And so it's described in my report as being frontward or leftward in reference to standard anatomic position, but I don't know where her arm was at the time that she was shot.
Sure. But you recover one bullet from inside her body, and then you have the entrance and exit wound on the outside of the wrist, and then it looks like sort of on the inside of the wrist is the exit wound?
I would say the outside of the wrist, but yes.
Okay, the outside of the wrist, and I guess the entrance wound at the top of the wrist, is that more appropriate?
Or the back of the wrist.
Back of the wrist, okay. Doctor, did you form an opinion as to the cause of Anglia Taylor's death based on your examination of her gunshot wounds?
Her cause of death was penetrating gunshot wound of chest.
All right. And can you tell us, again, would her death have been immediate, or would it have happened over some period of time?
I would expect her death to be rapid, likely seconds.
All right. And again, is that primarily from the massive loss of blood or the shutting down of other bodily functions?
Blood loss would be a component, and also remember that a bullet passed through the heart, which is going to limit the heart's ability to pump blood to the rest of the body.
Yes, sir. Now, in addition to your written report, did you also make use of diagrams to further explain your findings?
Yes, during the course of my autopsy, I'll use a standard body diagram and put a few marks on it in order to aid later on as I go through my report.
And these are attached and made a part of your autopsy report, is that correct?
They are.
May I approach with states 262 and 263?
Yes, sir.
Now, these are large, blown up cardboard exhibits. Do you recognize the contents of them?
Yes, these are true and representative copies of the diagrams attached to my report.
And would they aid you in illustrating your testimony further?
They would.
Your Honor, we'd ask to move states 262 and 263 into evidence at this time.
Any objection?
No, sir.
They are allowed.
And may he step down, Your Honor?
Yes.
Doctor, if you'll step down, I'm going to grab this easel and maybe you could point out some of your findings to the jurors through this diagram. And if you'd like to bring your notes down to refer to while you're testifying, that would be fine. Now, Dr. Nelson, what we have first is State's Exhibit 262. Is this the body diagram that you used in the Anglia Taylor autopsy?
Yes, it is.
All right. And again, this is a standard form you use for anyone's body. It's not representative of their size or their shape or anything like that. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's just a standard diagram.
All right. Well, Doctor, if you would just kind of walk us through the markings you made on this diagram and what they represent.
First, let's just talk about the diagram. I mentioned earlier standard anatomic position, and this is it illustrated for you. Someone standing upright, arms at the sides, palms facing outwards. The important markings to me on this diagram are, first off, there's a circle just above the left nipple. That's the entrance wound that we looked at in the photograph. There's a dotted triangle on the right side of the back, and that's the approximate location of where the bullet lodged just under the skin on the right side of the back. Along with those are some markings in my poor handwriting, and those are just the notes from the distance below the top of the head and left, right, and midline that we've been talking about. Looking at her left wrist, there's a circle on what I would describe as the back of the left wrist. That's the entrance wound that we looked at, and a triangle on the left wrist here. I'll point out that this triangle kind of looks like it's on the front on the left wrist here, but the problem is I'm trying to illustrate on a two-dimensional diagram a body which is three-dimensional. So this is not a perfect, accurate representation. It's simply something as a visual aid so that I can look at this and say, okay, there's an entrance, there's where the bullet lodged. Excuse me, there's an entrance, there's where the bullet lodged, there's an entrance, and there's an exit.
And the midline is represented just by that straight line from the chin down through the torso. Is that correct?
So we mentioned the midline earlier, the imaginary line that divides the body into left and right halves, and that is the purpose of this line here, shown on the back of the body, and this line here, shown on the front.
And do you attempt, I mean, you make measurements of entrance wounds, exit wounds, and where the projectiles are found in the body, and do you try to kind of, at least generally, fairly and accurately represent them on these diagrams?
As much as I can, but of course, we're all built differently, we're not all shaped the same, and so it's a best approximation.
Okay, thank you. Now, with regards to States 263, this is the exhibit showing the diagram of Sylvester Taylor's body from the autopsy. And again, I think you've already mentioned the limitations of the two-dimensional diagram. I would imagine that's especially relevant in this case. Is that right?
That's correct.
But if you could, just walk the jurors through the markings you've made on this diagram with reference to his injuries.
I'm going to follow along roughly in the order that we talked about his gunshot wounds. So we'll begin with an entrance wound that I labeled as D, and it was on the left hip here. That's the circle that I'm pointing to. And that bullet lodged in the right side of the chest, and there's a dotted triangle that I'm going to point to on the other side of the diagram here, with a few notes about how far below the top of the head and right in midline that was. The next wound we talked about, I labeled the entrance as A and the exit as G. In this case, entrance A is this circle on the left side of the upper back, and exit G is located on the anterior left chest, so that would be this triangle that I'm pointing to here with a G above that. We mentioned a perforating gunshot wound to the torso that I labeled as H and B. The entrance wound was on the left side of the chest here with a circle labeled as H, and the exit was labeled as B, which is on the left side of the back here, and the copy didn't quite come through, but that's a B just above that triangle. We mentioned a perforating gunshot wound to the torso with the entrance labeled as C, the exit labeled as E. The entrance C is here on the left side of the chest and has a circle, and then we see the exit labeled as E on the right side of the chest, labeled as a triangle. And again, it's always hard to write neatly and accurately on these diagrams. And then we mentioned that the bullet that exited here at E appears to have re-entered in the inner right arm. There is a circle here that's supposed to be an F just above it. Again, my handwriting is not the best, but that shows the entrance wound of that bullet. And then finally, the bullet that was recovered from the right arm is located here where there's a dotted triangle on the right side of the right, excuse me, roughly on the back of the right shoulder.
Thank you, Doctor. Now, did you make any note about the abrasions or contusions to the knees or shins, or is this simply to illustrate the gunshot wounds that would cause death?
I draw the locations roughly of some abrasions and contusions. They're hard to make out on this diagram, but here on the left knee, here on the right shin, are a few of my marks. And that's just to help me as I look at this diagram overall later on when I'm working on my report.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Doctor. You can step back up. And again, Doctor, with regards to Sylvester Taylor, there's obviously several different gunshot wounds and various paths through the body, but at least 3 of those wounds, it appears, went through the same, I guess, I think you referred to it as the give me just a second. The left pleural cavity.
I'd have to look back through to make sure that I agree. So please excuse me.
That's all right. And if it'll help, I can reference wound A, G, and HB, and I believe CE.
That's correct, yes.
All right. Thank you, Doctor. I don't have anything further.
Cross-examination.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
Just to clarify, in regards to Mrs. Taylor's wound to the wrist, it entered through, the entrance wound was on the back side of the wrist?
That's correct.
In regard to Mr. Taylor's injuries, you said that the cause of death was multiple gunshot wounds?
That's correct.
Were there any of the wounds that single-handedly could have led to death?
If you'll allow me to look through and see the best way to answer your question. I believe that any of the 4 wounds passing through the torso individually could have led to death, given sufficient time.
Okay. And you said that you have no way of telling in which order particular wounds have.
That's correct.
That's not something that you have the capability of doing.
No one does.
Okay. And you also couldn't tell whether the wounds, who was shot, which of the two victims was shot first, is that correct?
That's also correct, yes.
You said that there was one wound in which you saw soot and stippling to Mr. Taylor, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And if I may approach.
Yes.
And was that wound on the left side of the body?
I'll make sure that I've got that correct. That was the entrance wound that we described as entrance C, and I said that was on the left side of the chest.
Left side of the chest, so that would be, well, could you point in your own body?
Sure, and I'll look at my diagram too. Approximately here, and I'm pointing on the, sort of under my left arm.
I have no further questions.
Yeah. Redirect.
There you go.
Thank you, sir. You may step down.
Thank you.
May we approach the clerk
Yes.
very briefly?
For planning purposes, Mr. Waller and Mr. Lively, will there be further evidence for the state?
No, Your Honor.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the state's case. I'll speak with you further tomorrow morning when we resume. We're going to go into recess now until 9:30 in the morning. So while you're in recess, please recall all the instructions. Don't talk among yourselves or with anyone else about this case. Don't form or express opinions about the outcome. No media or independent investigation into these matters, and no conversation or communication with any parties, witnesses, or lawyers. If you leave your notepads in your chairs, and again, gather at 9:30 tomorrow morning in the deliberation room. Thank you all very much for your service. Everyone else, please remain seated. All right, at the close of the state's evidence, there are two things I'd like to do. One is entertain any motions that are made at this time, and also advise the defendant with respect to his decision to testify or not testify in this case. Mr. Brown?
Yes, Your Honor, we would make a motion to dismiss all the charges at the end of the state's evidence. We don't necessarily need to be heard on any. The only thing I would add at all is an argument that having both the felonious assault and the attempted murder, we would argue would violate the double jeopardy clause. We do realize there is North Carolina law that is contrary to us, but we do want to make that claim.
Yes, thank you. The motion is denied with respect to each of the four charges in this case. Mr. Holden, I want to talk to you about a decision that you need to make. This is a personal decision, and it's one that you alone must make. You should carefully listen to the advice of your counsel, but ultimately it's a decision that you have to make, and that decision is whether you will testify in this case. If you do choose to testify, there's some consequences that I want to make you aware of. The most significant consequence is that if you testify, you'll be waiving your constitutional privilege against self-incrimination. And what that means is that if you testify, you'll be required to answer the questions that are asked of you by both your counsel and by the prosecution, and you'll be required to answer those questions truthfully. So I wanted to make you aware of that and ask you first, do you understand what I've just explained to you, sir? All right. Do you need further explanation from me on any of it? All right. Counsel, Mr. Brown, Ms. Hamburger, have you had ample opportunity to discuss this issue with your client?
Yes, sir.
All right. And you'll have this evening before tomorrow to further discuss it as need be. And so I'll ask in the morning whether a decision's been reached on that matter. Should at this time again, you can tell me in the morning, but should we plan for evidence in the morning from the defense?
That is our plan right now.
All right, very well. We'll just hear the final decision on that tomorrow morning, and we'll be in recess until 9:30. I do have, let me just tell you, I do have draft copies of jury instructions that are very preliminary at this stage because obviously things may yet change depending on your decision to offer evidence and if the defendant testifies. But I do have drafts that I'd like to give you this evening so you can begin reviewing them so that when we do get to the point of a charge conference, we can move efficiently through that process. I'll have the clerk print those out, and they should be ready for you within a few moments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Be in recess until 9:30.
Very close to recess, 9:30, I'll say 6 off for.